Darius Hale stood motionless in the center of the arrivals terminal at Detroit Metropolitan Airport, his leather briefcase gripped tightly in his right hand. Officer Gavin Holt had his hand resting on his service weapon. A crowd was forming. Phones rose. Darius knew this moment would define everything. Over nearly 3 decades, he had risen through the ranks, surviving every obstacle the department had thrown at him. Now, on the eve of his official announcement as police chief, this confrontation could destroy it all, or it could change the entire system. He made his choice. Earlier that day, Darius Hale had stepped off the plane into Detroit Metropolitan Airport, carrying the particular exhaustion that comes after intense meetings in Washington. The Attorney General herself had requested his presence to discuss police reform initiatives that would position Detroit as a national model for community policing. At this stage in his life, Darius had learned to carry himself with quiet dignity, the kind born from decades of proving himself in rooms that had never wanted him there. His tailored charcoal suit fit perfectly, a small luxury he had allowed himself after the private call from Mayor Rachel Thompson, confirming his appointment as police chief. The leather briefcase in his hand had belonged to his father, a postal worker who had carried it for 30 years before passing it to Darius on the day he graduated from the police academy. The leather was softened by use in places. The brass clasps were tarnished despite regular polishing, but Darius would never dream of replacing it. Inside that briefcase, at that very moment, were the most important documents of his career. Reform proposals that would redefine how the Detroit police interacted with the community, especially communities of color that had suffered for generations under aggressive, biased policing. Darius thought of the press conference scheduled soon, imagining how he would stand at the podium and announce not only his appointment, but a comprehensive plan to transform the department. He allowed himself a small smile as he walked through the terminal, nodding to travelers blending into the afternoon crowd of business people and families. He was thinking of calling his wife Elena when he first noticed the police officer watching him. The officer was young, perhaps in his mid-30s, with the kind of rigid posture that suggested a military background or overcompensation. Darius had trained enough rookies to recognize the type. The officer's eyes locked on Darius, then dropped to the briefcase and returned to his face. Darius felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the sixth sense every black man develops when attention turns into scrutiny that can turn into danger. He kept walking, maintaining his pace without giving any sign he had noticed the surveillance. But Officer Gavin Holt had already made his decision. Holt quickened his step, closing the distance, his hand falling instinctively toward his duty belt. Darius heard the footsteps accelerating behind him and knew what was coming. He had lived this moment hundreds of times, not as a police chief, but as a black man in America. The voice that called out was sharp, aggressive, designed to intimidate rather than communicate. "Stop right there! Stop!" Darius stopped his body, responding to training that predated his police career. The training his parents had given him as a child about how to survive encounters with the police. He turned slowly, keeping his hands visible, the briefcase hanging naturally at his side. Holt stood with shoulders squared and chest out, projecting authority and aggression in equal measure. Darius noticed the body camera on the officer's chest, and then noticed something even more unsettling. The small red light that should have been blinking was off. The camera was disconnected. Holt stopped a short distance away, his right hand now resting openly on his service weapon. "Show me some identification right now." Darius kept his voice level and professional, the voice he had used to de-escalate countless situations. "Of course, officer. May I ask what this is about?" Holt's jaw tightened. "Don't play with me. You match the description of a suspect. We're investigating drug trafficking through this airport. I need to see your ID and search that briefcase. Darius felt his pulse quicken, but his exterior remained serene. And what would that description be? Holt's eyes narrowed. Black male, about 50, expensive clothes, leather briefcase. Are you going to tell me that's not you? The racial profiling was so blatant, so textbook, that Darius could hardly believe it. In an era with body cameras, oversight, and training, this officer was openly admitting he was stopping him based solely on race and the appearance of success. Darius looked around and saw other travelers slowing down, watching the interaction. Some had already pulled out their phones. I'm a law-abiding citizen, Darius said carefully. I'll gladly show you my identification, but I'd like to know what probable cause you have for a search. Holt took a step closer, raising his voice. The probable cause is that you're acting suspiciously and refusing to cooperate. Now, either you show me what's in that briefcase voluntarily, or I'll detain you, and we'll do this the hard way. Darius noted the implied threat, the escalation, the way Holt was now performing for the audience gathering in a loose semicircle. He saw an elderly black woman clutching her purse, eyes filled with familiar fear. He saw a young white couple whispering, the man already recording on his phone. He saw a South Asian family hurry past, the father pulling his children away from the confrontation. This was the moment Darius had prepared for throughout his career, not only as a police officer, but as a black man who had never stopped being a target. Officer, I respect your position, but I have rights under the Fourth Amendment. Unless you have probable cause beyond my race and appearance, this is an illegal detention. Holt's face reddened. His hand tightened on the weapon. You want to talk about rights? How about you take a step forward and put that briefcase on the ground before this becomes a problem? The threat was explicit now, and Darius saw Holt's left hand move toward his radio. Within seconds, the radio crackled to life. All units, I have a suspicious individual in Terminal C who is refusing to comply. Possible contraband. I need backup immediately. Darius's mind raced through options. He could reveal his identity in that instant. Tell the officer he was about to become his boss. End the confrontation immediately. But something stopped him. This moment, this exact scenario, was the reason he had spent decades working to reach the chief's position. This was the reality for thousands of black people every day, stopped, searched, and humiliated with nothing more than the color of their skin and bias as justification. If he revealed his identity now, the lesson would be lost. The documentation would be incomplete. The teaching moment wasted. So Darius remained still, briefcase in hand, and waited for backup to arrive. When two more officers came running moments later, hands near their weapons, Darius knew his choice carried consequences. The situation had just escalated from a simple detention to a potential arrest, and everything he had worked for hung in the balance. Officers Park and Rivera arrived with the aggressive energy of cops responding to a backup call, hands hovering near their holstered weapons, eyes scanning Darius for threats. Park was Asian American, perhaps in his 30s, lean and wiry, with a sharp gaze. Rivera was Latino, more solidly built, a few years older, with a thick mustache and the confident posture of someone who had been on the force long enough to trust his instincts. Both looked at Darius, then at Holt, trying to read the situation. Holt practically vibrated with adrenaline and vindication. This individual is being detained for suspicious behavior and possible possession of contraband in that briefcase. He has refused to cooperate and has been confrontational. Darius remained perfectly still, his decades of experience telling him any movement could be misinterpreted, weaponized, turned into justification for violence. The crowd had grown larger, perhaps 30 or 40 people forming a loose ring around the confrontation, blocking passage through the terminal. Airport announcements continued echoing overhead, surreal in their normalcy, calling passengers to gates while one man's freedom, and possibly his life, hung in the balance just meters away. Darius looked at each officer in turn, reading their body language, sensing Park's slight discomfort, Rivera's neutral assessment. Holt's barely contained aggression. He remembered a day years earlier, his first day on patrol with his training officer, a man who used racial slurs with such natural ease that Darius had briefly considered leaving the force altogether. He remembered that officer stopping a young black teenager for no reason, searching his car, humiliating him on the roadside, while explaining to Darius that this was how certain neighborhoods were kept under control. Darius had filed a complaint that went nowhere, absorbed by a system that protected its own. He remembered his first attempt at the sergeant's exam, scoring higher than any other candidate, and still not appearing on the promotion list. He remembered the lieutenant telling him to his face that he would never make captain because the department wasn't ready for black leadership at that level. He remembered every barrier, every insult, every time he was passed over despite exemplary service. And he remembered his son Jamal coming home the previous year, shaken after being stopped for the 7th time in a short period, always with some excuse about a broken taillight or failing to signal a turn. Always ending with a warning and no ticket, always leaving his son with a sense of violation and helplessness. That briefcase Darius carried contained his response to all those memories, to all that pain. Inside were proposals for mandatory bias training, designed by real civil rights experts, not the superficial compliance courses that changed nothing. Inside were plans for community oversight boards with real power to investigate and sanction officers. Inside were new protocols for body cameras that could not be turned off, with severe penalties for violations. Inside was a complete restructuring of how complaints were handled, removing them from the chain of command that had protected officers like that training officer and Holt for decades. And there was Darius, being treated exactly as the system had treated countless people, proving once again why every reform in that briefcase was necessary. "Officer," Darius said quietly, "I'm going to ask you again. What is the legal basis for this detention?" Holt stepped forward aggressively. "The legal basis is that you're acting suspiciously, not cooperating, and matching a suspect description. I'm done talking. Put that briefcase on the ground right now, or you're under arrest for obstruction." Darius felt time slow. This was the moment, the point where theory became reality, where principles met consequences. He could end this with 3 words, "I'm your chief." But he didn't. Instead, he carefully placed the briefcase on the floor at his feet and put his hands behind his head, interlacing his fingers. The crowd erupted in shouts. An elderly white man yelled that this was police brutality. A young black man stepped forward as if to intervene, held back by his girlfriend. The South Asian family that had tried to leave earlier stopped. The father was now recording on his phone, explaining to his children in hushed tones that they were witnessing an injustice. Park moved forward with handcuffs, while Rivera positioned himself to search Darius. Holt stayed back, supervising with his hand still on his weapon. As Rivera patted down Darius's sides, his back, his legs, Darius thought of his daughter Aisha, serving in the military overseas, who had enlisted in part to escape the constant surveillance black people face in civilian life. He thought of his wife Elena, a civil rights attorney, who had warned him that becoming chief wouldn't change anything if the officers under his command remained unchanged. He thought of his father, who had carried that briefcase through the streets of Detroit for decades, navigating a different but equally pervasive racism. The search revealed nothing because there was nothing to find. Darius carried a wallet, keys, a phone, and a pen. He was not a criminal, He was a decorated police officer with a career full of commendations. A man who had saved lives and built bridges in communities most officers avoided. But none of that mattered in that moment, because in that moment, he was simply a black man with an expensive briefcase. And that was enough to justify an arrest in Officer Gavin Holt's mind. "He's clean," Rivera reported, stepping back. Holt grabbed the briefcase from the floor, lifting it like a trophy. "Well, let's see what you were so desperate to hide." His hands moved toward the clasps. Park finally spoke, voice uncertain. "Holt, maybe we should verify his identity first. Check his ID." Holt dismissed it with a gesture. "I'll search first. Identify later. This guy thinks he can lecture me on the law. I'm about to show him what happens when you disrespect police authority." The crowd pressed closer. Someone shouted to call a lawyer. The young black man who had tried to intervene earlier yelled that everyone was recording, that this would be on every news outlet. Holt didn't care. He was committed now, trapped by his own aggression, unable to back down without admitting he was wrong. Darius watched him, seeing not just a racist cop, but the entire system that had created, trained, protected, and empowered him. And then, Darius made his decision. "Open it," he said calmly, his voice carrying through the terminal. "But know that when you do, your career in law enforcement will be over." The confidence in Darius's voice cut through the terminal noise like a blade. Holt froze, hands suspended over the briefcase clasps, suddenly uncertain. The crowd leaned forward collectively, sensing something significant was about to happen, even if they didn't understand what. Darius remained with his hands still behind his head, his posture somehow both obedient and commanding, a man who had spent decades learning to project authority, even when physically restrained. Holt's face moved through a rapid sequence of emotions: confusion at Darius's certainty, anger at being challenged, fear that he might have made a mistake, and finally, stubbornness. The refusal to back down that had likely gotten him into trouble before. "You're threatening me," Holt demanded, trying to regain control. "That's assaulting an officer." Darius didn't take the bait. "I'm not threatening you, officer. I'm simply stating a fact. When you open that briefcase, you're going to learn something about yourself, about me, and about the system you think protects you. Now open it." The psychology was perfect. By inviting the search, by challenging Holt to proceed, Darius had shifted the power dynamic without moving a single muscle. Holt looked at Park and Rivera, perhaps expecting backup, but both officers had taken a slight step back, distancing themselves from what was about to happen. They had responded to enough calls with Holt to know he had a pattern, a tendency toward aggression, and now their body cameras were recording the entire interaction. If this went wrong, they wanted plausible deniability. Darius saw their retreat and understood it. These officers weren't necessarily bad men. They were products of a system that rewarded aggression and protected the aggressive, that promoted officers who made arrests regardless of legality, that measured success in numbers rather than community trust. Park and Rivera had likely witnessed Holt's behavior before and said nothing, making them complicit. But it also meant they could be redeemed. That calculation mattered because Darius was already thinking 3 steps ahead, considering who could be salvaged and reformed when he implemented his new protocols. Holt clicked open the first clasp. The sound was surprisingly loud in the terminal that had suddenly gone quiet. People had stopped talking, stopped moving, sensing they were witnessing something important. A mother covered her young son's eyes as if expecting violence. A businessman in a suit adjusted his tie nervously. The elderly black woman who had gasped earlier had tears running down her face, undoubtedly remembering her own encounters with police, her own humiliations, her own narrow escapes from situations that could have turned deadly. The second clasp opened with a click. Holt lifted the lid slowly, theatrically, still performing for his imaginary audience of supporters. His expression was triumphant, vindicated, righteous. And then it changed. The transformation was almost comic in its speed. Triumph turned to confusion, then to shock, then to horror. Each emotion crossed his face in less than 2 seconds. He looked inside the briefcase as if he had opened a box of snakes. Inside were no drugs, no stacks of cash, no weapons, no contraband of any kind. Instead, carefully organized in folders, were official documents bearing the seals of the Detroit Police Department, the City of Detroit, and the United States Department of Justice. On top, impossible to ignore, was a letter on official DOPD letterhead addressed to Police Chief Darius Hale, detailing the transition timeline for his assumption of command. Holt's hands began to tremble. He picked up the letter and read the first lines, lips moving silently. Rivera stepped closer, looking over Holt's shoulder, and his eyes widened. Park also stepped forward to read, and the color drained from his face. "Oh no," Park whispered. "Oh no, no, no." Darius finally lowered his hands from behind his head, no longer complying with an illegal detention the officers had forgotten to enforce. He drew himself to his full height, and suddenly the power dynamic in the terminal reversed completely. Holt's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the letter. Beneath it were more documents, each more incriminating than the last. A memo from the mayor's office welcoming Darius to his new position. A tentative schedule for his swearing-in ceremony. A report on the department's current challenges. And beneath all of that, the reform proposals Darius had been working on for months. Proposals for body camera accountability. Plans for mandatory bias training. New protocols for stop and frisk procedures. Structures for community oversight committees. Disciplinary reforms for officers with excessive force complaints. Internal investigation procedures. Everything Holt represented, everything that was wrong with the current system, was in those documents marked for elimination. Gary, the airport supervisor, pushed through the crowd, demanding to know what was happening. Rivera explained quietly, and Gary's professional composure cracked instantly. His face paled. He looked at Darius with a mixture of recognition and absolute terror. "Chief Hale," Gary stammered. "I had no idea. I'm so sorry." Holt remained frozen, holding the letter that condemned him, staring at Darius as if seeing him for the first time. And in a way, he was. Before, Darius had been just another black man to control, suspect, humiliate. Now, suddenly, he was the man who would command Holt's entire world within days. He was the man with the power to fire, to sanction, to restructure the entire department. More than that, he was the man who could ensure Holt never worked in law enforcement again. The crowd began to understand. Whispers spread outward in waves. Someone said, "They just arrested the new police chief." Another said, "He's black," and they racially profiled him. A third voice said, "This is going to be huge," and it already was. Phones were everywhere, recording from a dozen angles, streaming live to social media platforms, where the video was being shared exponentially. Hashtags were already forming. Hashtag Justice for Chief Hale. Hashtag Reform DPD. Hashtag Racial Profiling at the airport. The incident Holt had initiated to assert his authority had become a national story in real time, and he was the villain. Park and Rivera both took another step back, separating from Holt both physically and symbolically. They weren't just distancing themselves from a bad stop. They were abandoning a sinking ship, cutting loose an officer who had just publicly humiliated the incoming police chief through blatant racial profiling. Holt finally found his voice. "I didn't know," he said, voice breaking. "I didn't know who you were." Darius looked at him with an expression that was both stern and sad, disappointment rather than anger. "Officer Holt, I'm going to ask you a question, and your career depends on your answer." The terminal fell absolutely silent. Even the overhead announcements seemed to pause, as if the entire airport was holding its breath. If a white man in an expensive suit carrying the same briefcase had walked through this airport this afternoon, would you have stopped him? The question hung in the air like smoke. Everyone knew the answer. Holt knew the answer. Park and Rivera knew the answer. The crowd knew the answer. The thousands watching the live streams knew the answer. The silence stretched for long seconds. Holt opened his mouth and closed it. He opened it again. He looked around desperately, as if expecting someone to rescue him. But no rescue was possible. The truth was too obvious, too documented, too recorded from too many angles. "No," Holt finally whispered. The admission was barely audible, but in the silent terminal, everyone heard it. "No," he repeated, louder now, voice breaking. "No, I wouldn't have stopped him." Darius nodded slowly. "That's called racial profiling, officer. It's illegal. It's immoral. And it's exactly what I'm going to eradicate from this department, starting with you." And then, before anyone could respond, a notification chimed simultaneously on dozens of phones. Someone in the crowd had started a live stream focused specifically on the confrontation, and it had just hit thousands of viewers. Then more, then even more. In under a minute, the stream had tens of thousands of people watching a white officer admit he had racially profiled the incoming black police chief of Detroit. The story was now national, inevitable, unstoppable, and everyone involved knew it. The live stream notification created a ripple effect through the crowd as people checked their phones and realized they weren't just witnessing a local incident, but a national moment. Someone in the crowd shouted that major networks had picked up the story. Another said it was trending. A teenager announced that the hashtag was climbing rapidly. Darius watched this digital explosion with mixed feelings. This wasn't how he had wanted to begin his tenure as chief. He had imagined a carefully controlled press conference, a measured statement about reform, a professional presentation of his vision for the department. Instead, the world was watching him be humiliated, profiled, detained, and searched based solely on the color of his skin. But there was power in that, too. He realized every black person watching would recognize their own experiences in this moment. Every parent who had given their children the talk about surviving police encounters would see this and know the new chief understood. Every community activist who had been fighting police brutality would have documented proof from multiple angles that the problem reached the highest levels. This moment demonstrated exactly why reform was necessary, not through statistics or reports, but through raw, undeniable reality. Gary, the supervisor, had disappeared, presumably to call his superiors and begin damage control. Park and Rivera stood to the side, uncomfortable. No longer participants, but not entirely willing to leave. Holt remained frozen, still holding the letter, still processing the magnitude of his mistake. And Darius stood at the center of it all, in the eye of a storm that was about to get much worse. Captain Renee Harlan pushed through the crowd with the authority of someone who had demanded respect for decades. She was a black woman in her 50s, tall and imposing in her captain's uniform, her face lined by someone who had fought many battles and won most of them. Darius had known Renee for 20 years. She had served above him when she was a sergeant, and he was a rookie. He had watched her face the same barriers he had, and overcome them through pure competence and determination. She assessed the scene with one comprehensive glance, her eyes moving from Holt to the briefcase, from Darius to the crowd of recording phones, and her expression shifted from professional concern to personal fury. "Darius," she said, voice tight with controlled anger, then corrected herself. "Chief Hale, are you all right?" Darius appreciated the immediate use of his title, the public assertion of his authority, the subtle rebuke to everyone who had treated him as a suspect. "I'm fine, Renee. Thank you." She turned to Holt with an expression that could have stripped paint from walls. "Officer Holt, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. Surrender your weapon and badge." Holt finally seemed to emerge from his state of shock. He looked at Harlan with desperate eyes. "Captain, I made a mistake. I didn't know who he was." "That's precisely the problem," Harlan said coldly. "It shouldn't matter who he is. You stopped a citizen based on racial profiling, conducted an illegal search, and threatened to arrest him without probable cause. The fact that he turns out to be our new chief only makes your mistake more public. But you've been making the same mistake for months, haven't you?" Holt's face went from pale to ashen. Harlan hadn't known. She had known his pattern of bias complaints, his tendency toward aggression with black civilians, his history of questionable stops, and either hadn't been able to discipline him under the current system or hadn't tried hard enough. Darius filed that information away, mentally, for later. Reform couldn't focus only on individual officers. It had to address the command structure that enabled them. But before Harlan could continue, Deputy Chief Walter Graves arrived, and the temperature in the terminal seemed to drop. Graves was a white man in his mid-60s, 2 years from retirement, with military bearing and cold blue eyes. He had been interim chief for months while the mayor searched for the right candidate, and had not hidden his belief that he should have received the permanent position. Graves had decades on the force, powerful union connections, and friends on the city council. He was the embodiment of old-school policing, the kind of commander who believed in aggressive tactics and the thin blue line above all else. His arrival meant the situation was about to become political. "Harlan," Graves said sharply, ignoring Darius entirely. "Situation report." Harlan's jaw tightened, but she responded with professionalism. "Officer Holt detained Chief Hale without probable cause, engaged in racial profiling, and conducted an illegal search. I've relieved him of duty pending investigation." Graves' eyes finally landed on Darius, and there was no warmth in them, no congratulations on the promotion, no acknowledgement of achievement, only cold assessment and barely disguised resentment. "Hale," Graves said dryly, then corrected himself with minimal respect. "Chief Hale, seems you've created quite a situation here." Darius felt his temper flare for the first time since everything began. He had maintained perfect composure while being detained, searched, humiliated, and held. But Graves's dismissive tone, his implied suggestion that Darius was somehow responsible for being racially profiled, pushed him to a limit he rarely approached. "Deputy Chief Graves," Darius said, voice carrying the steel of someone who had run out of patience, "I did not create this situation. Officer Holt created it when he decided a black man with a briefcase must be a criminal. The system created it when it failed to discipline officers with patterns of bias complaints. And you are perpetuating it right now by suggesting I am to blame for being a victim of racial profiling." The crowd that had been watching in silence erupted in applause and shouts of support. Graves's expression darkened. "We need to clear this crowd and calm the situation," he told Harlan. "We don't need this turning into a circus." "It's already a circus," Harlan replied quietly. "It's being streamed live to hundreds of thousands of people right now." Graves's head snapped toward the phones, seeing them for the first time, and his face went rigid as he realized this could not be controlled or contained. Everything said here, everything done here was being recorded and broadcast in real time. There was no way to manipulate this, to manage the narrative, to protect Holt from consequences. The documentation was overwhelming and public. He looked back at Darius, and something shifted in his expression. Fine. Hale. Chief Hale. I apologize for Officer Holt's behavior. The department will conduct a full investigation. In the meantime, I suggest we move this conversation to a private location. Darius shook his head. No. This conversation happens right here, right now, in front of these witnesses and these cameras, because this is exactly the kind of thing that has been happening in private for far too long. Do you know what's in this briefcase? Reform proposals, plans to change how this department operates, mandatory body camera protocols, bias training, community oversight, disciplinary procedures for officers with complaint patterns. Everything I've been working on for months. And in one afternoon, Officer Holt just demonstrated why every one of these reforms is necessary. Graves's eyes narrowed. We can discuss your reforms through proper channels once you've officially sworn in. Until then, I'm still Deputy Chief, and I'm ordering this terminal cleared. Darius took a step forward, and despite Graves being his nominal superior for a short time more, despite the crowd, despite the cameras, it was Graves who took a step back. Deputy Chief, I am assuming command effective immediately. Graves's face flushed red. You can't do that. You haven't been sworn in yet. Darius pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and put it on speaker. The crowd leaned closer to listen. After 2 rings, a woman's voice answered. Mayor Thompson. Mayor, Darius said clearly. This is Darius Hale. I'm at Detroit Metropolitan Airport, where I was just racially profiled, illegally searched, and detained by one of our officers. Deputy Chief Graves is here trying to suppress the situation rather than address it. I'm requesting immediate emergency authorization to assume command of the department. There was a brief pause. Then the mayor's voice returned, tight with controlled fury. Darius, I've been watching the live stream. Half the city has been watching. Put Graves on the phone. Darius handed the phone to Graves, whose face went through several shades of red as he listened to what the mayor was saying. The conversation was brief and clearly one-sided. Graves returned the phone without meeting Darius's eyes. Chief Hale, the mayor said, voice now warm and full of support. You have my full authorization to assume command immediately. I'll issue an executive order within the hour to make it official. Graves will cooperate fully with your transition or face early retirement. Thank you, Mayor, Darius said. She hung up, and Darius turned to face not just Graves, but the crowd, the cameras, the officers, and by extension, the entire city watching this unfold. As of this moment, I am the police chief. My first order is that Officer Holt be suspended pending a full investigation. My second order is that Deputy Chief Graves turn over all communications related to airport security assignments for the past 6 months. My third order is that all officers present activate their body cameras immediately. Harlan, I want a full report on my desk first thing tomorrow. Graves is relieved of duty pending review. Graves started to protest, then looked at the cameras and the crowd, and clearly calculated that any resistance would be professional suicide. He turned and walked away, shoulders rigid with humiliation and rage. Holt looked as if he might faint, and then Holt did something unexpected. He suddenly dropped the briefcase, turned, and ran. He actually ran, pushing through the crowd, sprinting toward the terminal exit like a fugitive. The crowd parted in shock. Harlan shouted for him to stop. Park and Rivera froze, unsure what to do. And Darius watched his antagonist flee, understanding that Holt had just transformed from a racist cop into something much worse, a coward and a fugitive, making everything exponentially more damaging to the department's reputation and infinitely more complicated to resolve. The terminal erupted into chaos as Holt fled. Harlan immediately radioed for all exits to be secured, while Park and Rivera finally reacted, running after their former colleague. Darius remained still, his mind already processing the implications of a police officer fleeing accountability, understanding that this moment had just evolved from a teaching opportunity into a full-blown crisis. The crowd surged forward en masse, everyone trying to see where Holt had gone. Phones followed his flight like dozens of documentary cameras. Airport security personnel appeared from multiple directions, responding to Harlan's radio call. TSA agents at nearby checkpoints abandoned their posts to block exits. The private security force mobilized with impressive speed, creating a perimeter that made escape nearly impossible. Darius watched the coordinated response and felt a strange mixture of pride and sadness. The system could function with efficiency when motivated. The problem was that it had taken a white officer fleeing to activate that efficiency, while the racial profiling of a black man had been treated as routine. The Detroit news reporter arrived breathless, her press credentials bouncing on a lanyard around her neck. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, black, with sharp, intelligent eyes, and a recording device already in hand. "Sarah Jennings, Detroit News," she said quickly. "Chief Hale, can I get a statement?" Darius looked at her, then at the cameras, then at the crowd that had gone quiet, waiting for his response. This was the moment. What he said now would define his tenure, shape the narrative, determine whether this became just another scandal or a true catalyst for change. "Before I make any statement," Darius said carefully, "I want to address directly the people of Detroit who are watching this. What happened to me today happens to black people in this city every day. The only difference is that I have a title and position that gave me a protection most citizens don't have. Officer Holt didn't profile me because he's an isolated bad apple. He profiled me because he was trained in a system that teaches officers to see black success as suspicious, black dignity as threatening, black humanity as secondary. The system created Holt, protected Holt, enabled Holt, and when his actions finally had consequences, the system tried to suppress what happened rather than confront it. That ends now." The crowd erupted in applause, but Darius raised a hand for silence. He wasn't finished. "Sarah Jennings will ask me if I'm going to press charges. Here's my answer. I will not press personal charges because what happened to me is not personal. It is systemic. But Officer Holt will face departmental discipline, and if the investigation reveals criminal conduct, the prosecutor's office will make that determination. More importantly, this incident will become the foundation for comprehensive reform. Every proposal in this briefcase," he said, pointing to the leather case Harlan had recovered, "will be implemented. Body cameras that cannot be turned off, real consequences for bias, community oversight with genuine power, and most critically, a cultural shift that treats citizens as people to be served, not suspects to be controlled." Sarah Jennings took notes frantically. "Chief Hale, this will affect your relationship with the police union." Darius smiled without humor. "The union can be part of the solution or part of the problem. I hope they choose wisely. And Deputy Chief Graves, why did you relieve him of duty?" "That's under investigation," Darius said carefully. "But I will say this. If anyone in the command structure enabled or encouraged the behavior we saw today, they will be held accountable regardless of rank or seniority. This is not about revenge. It is about accountability." Harlan approached, her radio crackling with updates. "We have him," she reported quietly. They found him hiding in the Interfaith Chapel near Terminal B. Park and Rivera are bringing him back now. Darius nodded. Make sure his body camera is activated and recording. I want everything documented. In under 5 minutes, Holt was led back through the terminal in handcuffs, and the image was devastating. The white officer who had racially profiled a black man was now himself reduced and humiliated, his face soaked in tears, his career in ruins, his future uncertain. The crowd watched in silence as he was marched past them, some recording, others simply staring in disbelief at how quickly power could reverse. Darius felt no satisfaction, only a deep sadness in his chest. Holt was young enough to have changed, to have learned, to have become something better. But the system had never required him to examine his biases, never questioned his prejudices, never held him accountable for his pattern of discriminatory conduct. And now, instead of a career dedicated to serving his community, he faced termination, possible criminal charges, and national infamy as the face of police racism. Harlan cleared a private area, a small conference room at the airport normally used for security meetings. She ushered Holt inside, still cuffed, and indicated for Darius to enter. Park and Rivera remained on guard outside. Darius sat across from Holt at a small table. Up close, he could see how young Holt really was. He could see the panic in his eyes. He could see the exact moment Holt understood there was no escape, no excuse, no way to undo what he had done. "Why did you run?" Darius asked quietly. Holt shook his head, unable or unwilling to answer. "Running made it worse. You know that, right? You turned a disciplinary matter into possible obstruction of justice, fleeing an investigation." Holt finally lifted his gaze, eyes red. "I panicked. I knew I'd destroyed my entire career, my reputation, my future. 20 seconds on a live stream, and my whole life was over." Darius leaned back in the chair. "No, your life isn't over. But your life as a police officer probably is. And that's appropriate, because you abused the authority we gave you. Do you understand what you did today?" "I profiled you," Holt whispered. Darius shook his head. "It's bigger than that. You saw a successful black man, and your first instinct was to assume criminality. You saw dignity and interpreted it as arrogance that needed to be humiliated. You saw someone exercising his rights and called it resistance that required force. Every decision you made was filtered through a racial bias so deep you didn't even recognize it as bias. You thought you were doing your job. That's the problem." Holt was crying openly now. "I was raised differently. My father, my uncles, they taught me certain things about certain people. I thought I'd moved past that. I thought I was better than that. But today I saw you, and I just reacted." Darius felt a flicker of something that might have been compassion. "That's the most honest thing you've said. But this is what you need to understand. Your bias didn't develop in a vacuum. The department trained it into you, reinforced it, rewarded it. How many times have you stopped black people without cause?" "Dozens," Holt admitted. "More. And what happened? Nothing. Sometimes my supervisor told me, 'Good job.'" Darius absorbed that, jaw tightening. "That's going to change across the entire department. But you won't be part of it." Holt nodded miserably. "I know I'm going to be fired." "Probably," Darius said. "But that's not the end. You can spend the rest of your life bitter, blaming me, blaming the system, becoming one of those ex-cops who go on right-wing media to complain about political correctness. Or you can truly face what you did, get real help, and maybe someday become someone who prevents others from making your same mistakes." Holt looked up, surprised. "You're not going to press charges?" Darius shook his head. "I won't. The department will investigate and discipline you, but I won't push for criminal charges on the stop itself. However, Darius continued, voice hardening, if you lie during the investigation, if you try to minimize what you did, if you attack me or the reform process, that changes. And Holt, is there anything else I need to know about Deputy Chief Graves? Holt's eyes widened slightly, a signal Darius caught immediately. The younger officer knew something. Graves assigned you to airport duty, didn't he? After you accumulated complaints in your previous assignment. Holt hesitated, then nodded slowly. Tell me about that, Darius said quietly. And Holt began to talk, revealing information that would transform this from an isolated incident into evidence of systemic corruption reaching into the command structure itself. Holt spoke for 15 minutes, and with every revelation, Darius felt his understanding of the department's dysfunction deepen. Graves had specifically assigned Holt to airport duty 6 months earlier, after Holt accumulated multiple civilian complaints in his previous district. But instead of discipline or retraining, Graves had simply transferred him, telling him airport work would be easier because travelers were less likely to file complaints, and most interactions were brief. More disturbingly, Graves had specifically instructed Holt to maintain aggressive vigilance over certain demographic groups. He never said it explicitly. Racially, Holt explained, voice trembling. He was too smart for that. But he'd say things like, keep an eye on the usual suspects, or, you know, the kind of people we're looking for. And when I stopped someone who fit that profile and found nothing, he still praised me for being vigilant. He made it clear what he valued was proactive policing, even if it didn't lead to arrests. Darius listened without interrupting, his mind cataloging every detail for the investigation he would launch immediately. Did anyone else hear those conversations? Holt nodded. Officer Rivera was present for some of them. A few other officers, too. Graves would make comments in briefings, always vague enough to have plausible deniability, but clear enough that we understood what he meant. And there's more, Holt continued, seeming to realize that full cooperation might be his only path to any kind of redemption. Graves has been deliberately undermining community policing initiatives for years. Every time officers tried to build relationships in black neighborhoods, he'd reassign them or cut their programs, claiming budget reasons. He's old school. He believes in control through force and intimidation, not collaboration. Darius absorbed that understanding and knew now why his reform proposals would face such fierce resistance. Graves represented an entire generation of command staff who had built their careers on aggressive tactics and would fight to preserve that approach. Do you have any documentation? Text messages, emails, recordings? Holt shook his head. Graves was careful. Everything was verbal or in person. But Rivera might have taken notes. He was uncomfortable with a lot of what Graves said, but was afraid to speak up. Darius stood, signaling the interview was over. You're going to repeat everything you just told me in a formal statement to Internal Affairs. Officer Park will take you now to make that statement. Holt, look at me. The younger officer held his gaze, and Darius saw genuine remorse mixed with fear and shame. What you did today was wrong. What Graves did was worse, because he created the environment that made officers like you think racial profiling was acceptable. Both of you are going to face consequences. But if you're honest in your statement, if you don't minimize or deflect responsibility, I'll make sure the investigators know you cooperated. That won't save your job, but it might give you the chance to move forward with some dignity. Holt nodded with gratitude. Chief Hale, I'm sorry. I really am sorry. Darius didn't respond to the apology. Some things couldn't be fixed with words. He left the conference room and found Harlan waiting with Park and Rivera. Rivera, Darius said, Officer Holt indicated you might have information about Deputy Chief Graves' assignment decisions and comments in briefings. Rivera's expression was conflicted. Sir, I heard some things that concerned me. Yes. Did you document any of it? Rivera hesitated, then nodded slowly. I took notes on my phone. Dates, times, what was said. I thought about filing a complaint, but I was afraid of retaliation. Graves has ruined careers before. Darius felt a surge of hope. That documentation would be crucial for building a case against Graves and anyone else in the command structure who had enabled systemic bias. I need you to secure those notes and turn them over to Internal Affairs. You'll have whistleblower protection. Both you and Park will be the first members of a new internal accountability unit I'm creating, if you're willing. The unit will investigate misconduct, protect officers who report problems, and ensure accountability at all levels. Both officers looked stunned. Park spoke first. Sir, I'm going to be honest. I should have intervened yesterday. When Holt stopped you, I knew it was wrong, but I didn't step in. I thought about my career, my pension, my family. That makes me complicit. Darius appreciated the honesty. Yes, it does. But awareness is the first step toward change. You can spend your career regretting that moment, or you can spend it making sure other officers don't make the same mistake. I'm giving you that opportunity. You're going to take it. Both officers nodded immediately, and Darius saw genuine commitment in their expressions. They were men who wanted to be good police officers, but had been caught in a bad system. With the right leadership and support, they could become part of the solution. Darius returned to the main terminal area, where the crowd had thinned somewhat, but dozens of people remained, many still recording. Sarah Jennings approached again with more questions, and Darius granted a longer interview, explaining his vision for reform and his determination to address bias at every level of the department. Mayor Thompson called to inform him the city council was demanding an emergency meeting to discuss the incident and his immediate assumption of command. The police union president left a furious voicemail objecting to Graves's suspension without due process. Media requests poured in from local and national outlets wanting interviews. And through it all, Darius's phone kept vibrating with messages of support from community activists, religious leaders, city officials, and ordinary citizens who had seen the live stream and felt vindicated that their experiences with racial profiling were finally being taken seriously at the highest level. But Darius barely had time to process any of that, because his phone rang again with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. Hale speaking. There was a pause, then a deliberately disguised voice, artificially deep and electronically distorted. Congratulations, Chief. You've just made some powerful enemies. Watch your back. The line went dead before Darius could respond. He stood completely still in the middle of the terminal, holding the phone, understanding that the price of reform might be higher than he had anticipated. The system didn't just need to be changed. It would fight with ferocity and personally against anyone who threatened its comfortable corruption. Harlan saw his expression. Sir, everything all right? Darius made a decision in that instant. He could keep the threat private, handle it quietly, protect himself and his family without creating more drama. Or he could make it public, expose the intimidation that accompanied challenging corrupt systems, and turn even the threat into ammunition for reform. He put the phone on speaker and pressed the callback button. The number didn't ring. It went straight to a recording saying it was no longer in service. Darius looked at Harlan, at Park and Rivera, who had rejoined them, and at Sarah Jennings, who was close enough to have heard everything. This call is being reported to the FBI, Darius said loudly, ensuring the statement was captured by the phone still recording around him. Threats against police chiefs are federal crimes. Whoever called me just learned that. I don't intimidate. I don't back down. And threats only prove how necessary this reform is. The remaining crowd applauded. But Darius wasn't performing for an audience. He was sending a message to Graves, to his allies, to anyone inside the department or the city who thought they could preserve the old system through intimidation. The war for the soul of the Detroit Police Department had just begun, and Darius was declaring he intended to win it. In short order, FBI agents were at the airport. Darius briefed them quickly and efficiently, providing the phone number and describing the distorted voice. The agents took his phone to attempt tracing the call and analyzing the voice modulation. A female agent pulled him aside for a private conversation. "Chief Hale, these kinds of threats usually fall into two categories. Either they're empty intimidation meant to scare you into backing down, or they're preludes to real violence. Given what you've just exposed about corruption in your department, I'd lean toward taking them seriously. We can provide protection if you'd like." Darius considered it, weighing the optics of a police chief needing FBI protection against the reality that people who had built their careers on corrupt practices might not yield that power peacefully. "My family," he said. "That's our primary concern," the agent confirmed. "Your wife, your son, your daughter is military, so she has some protection. But we should notify her chain of command. We can have agents at your home within the hour." Darius agreed, then made the difficult call to Elena. She answered on the first ring, voice tight with emotion. "Darius, I've been watching everything. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he assured her, but a complication has arisen. He explained the threat, and he could hear her shift instantly from worried wife to attorney mode. "That's witness intimidation at minimum, possibly conspiracy to obstruct justice. And Graves is involved. Darius, you need to file a formal complaint and get protection." "I'm already doing both," he said. "The FBI is handling it. Elena, I'm sorry. I know this isn't how you wanted this to begin." Her voice softened. "I'm proud of you. What you did today, standing there and documenting that profiling instead of just pulling rank, that took courage. And exposing Graves's corruption is going to save lives. Just please, please be careful." His son Jamal called moments after he hung up with Elena. "Dad," he said without preamble, "I'm driving back from Ann Arbor. My professor saw the videos in class and told us what happened. I should be there." "No," Darius said firmly. "You stay in Michigan. Finish your classes. This is exactly why I'm doing this job. So you and people like you don't have to live with this constant threat. But let me ask you something. How does it feel watching what happened to me?" There was a long pause. "Honestly, validating. Every time I got stopped, every time I tried to tell you how it felt, I wondered if I was being too sensitive or paranoid. Seeing it happen to you, seeing how blatant it was, shows I wasn't wrong. It happens. It's real. And now, maybe people will believe us. That's why I didn't end it quickly," Darius explained. "I needed everyone to see it, to understand it, so there was no room for denial. Change requires evidence, and now we have it from every angle." His daughter Aisha called from overseas, where she had been woken by fellow service members telling her about the viral videos. She was furious, protective, and worried all at once. Darius reassured her and promised to stay safe, and finally ended the family calls to return to the immediate crisis. The airport had been shut down for hours. Flights were delayed. Travelers were frustrated. The terminal area where the confrontation occurred was now a crime scene, with FBI agents photographing everything and interviewing witnesses. Harlan approached with an update. "Graves has been located at his home in Grosse Pointe. He's not answering internal affairs calls. We can get a warrant if necessary." "Not yet," Darius decided. "Let him stew overnight. If he's smart, He'll hire a lawyer. If he's guilty and panicking, he might make mistakes. Either way, we'll have Rivera's documentation and Holt's statement by morning. How's the media situation? Harlan's expression was tight. CNN wants you live in studio. MSNBC is requesting an exclusive. Fox News is running segments with union representatives, calling this a political hit job. Local news has satellite trucks circling headquarters, and social media is exploding. You're trending globally. Darius had expected it, but it still felt surreal. How's headquarters handling it? Chaos, Harlan admitted. Half the command staff is trying to figure out who's in charge. The other half is closing ranks, calling this an attack on law enforcement. Rank and file officers are split. Some say finally someone's addressing the problems. Others are furious you suspended Graves without due process. The union president is threatening action. Darius pulled out his phone and called the union president directly. The man answered immediately, voice aggressive. Chief Hale, I'm calling for a vote of no confidence. You can't suspend a deputy chief without following proper procedures. President Walsh, Darius said calmly, I can, and I did. Deputy Chief Graves is under investigation for possibly enabling and encouraging racial profiling, which is illegal and a violation of department policy. He'll have due process through the investigation, but he's not going to remain in a position of authority while that investigation proceeds. That's retaliation for questioning your tactics at the airport. No, it's protection of the public and the integrity of this department, Darius corrected. And I'll tell you something else, Walsh. The union can be part of the reform or part of the problem. If you want to defend officers who racially profile citizens, that's your choice. But when the federal consent decree comes down, and it will after today's documented violations, you'll wish you'd been on the right side of history. He hung up before Walsh could respond, knowing he had just made another enemy, but not caring. The union had protected bad officers for too long. That era was ending. Hours after the confrontation began, Darius finally left the airport. FBI agents escorted him to his car and then followed him home in an unmarked vehicle. News vans were already parked on his street, and he had to push through reporters shouting questions just to reach the front door. Elena met him at the entrance and pulled him into a tight embrace. They stood there for a long moment without speaking, just holding each other as the weight of the day settled over them. Finally, she pulled back and looked at him. They're really going to come for you, Darius. Graves, the union, everyone who benefits from the old system. This isn't going to be a fair fight. I know, he acknowledged. But I've been preparing for this my entire career. Every time I was passed over for promotion, every time I faced discrimination, every time I watched the system fail communities, I was learning. I know their tactics, I know their weaknesses, and I have something they don't. What's that? The truth, documented from every angle, broadcast to the world. They can't spin reality out of this. Too many people saw it. That night, Darius barely slept. He lay in bed replaying everything that had happened, planning his next moves, anticipating the attacks that would come. In the early hours, his phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words. They're watching you. Darius got up, looked out his bedroom window, and saw nothing unusual. But he felt the threat. He understood that whoever had called earlier was following through, making it clear he wasn't safe even in his own home. He called the FBI agent overseeing his protection detail and reported the message. The agent promised to increase patrols around his home and traced the number. But Darius knew these tactics: anonymous threats, psychological warfare, attempts to make him paranoid and ineffective. He had seen it before, deployed against activists and reformers who challenged police authority. The difference was that this time, the target was the chief himself. At dawn, Darius's phone rang. It was Harlan. Voice tense. "Sir, you need to turn on the news. Channel 4. Darius grabbed the remote and turned on the local news. The anchor was mid-sentence, and the headline ticker made his stomach drop. Exclusive. Deputy Chief Graves claims new Chief Hale has a history of anti-police activism, questions his fitness for command. The segment showed Graves looking calm and professional, sitting for an interview conducted the previous night. He spoke measuredly about his concerns regarding Darius's immediate suspension without investigation, his worry that Darius had a predetermined agenda against experienced officers, and his implication that the airport incident had been deliberately provoked to create justification for radical reforms. It was masterful propaganda, hitting every note that would resonate with police defenders: respect for procedure, concern about politics over policing, the narrative of a department under attack, and it was completely false, but packaged in language reasonable enough that people who wanted to doubt Darius had ammunition. Darius watched the entire segment, then called Harlan. "Call a press conference for 9 this morning. I'm going to address this directly. And get me Rivera's documentation and Holt's statement. It's time to show everyone exactly what Graves enabled and why he was suspended." "Sir," Harlan said carefully, "are you sure you want to escalate this publicly? This is Graves trying to make you react emotionally." Darius smiled without humor. "I'm not reacting emotionally. I'm responding strategically. Graves just gave me the perfect opportunity to expose everything. By 9, the truth about his corruption will be a public record." Harlan paused, then her voice softened with approval. "I'll have everything ready." The war was escalating, but Darius had prepared for this battle his entire life, and he was done playing defense. The press conference was held at police headquarters, in a room packed beyond capacity with local and national media. Darius stood at the podium, flanked by Harlan and the Internal Affairs commander, with Rivera and Park in uniform behind them. The symbolism was deliberate, the new chief with his reform team presenting a united front against corruption. Darius didn't waste time with formalities. "Yesterday at Detroit Metropolitan Airport, I was racially profiled, illegally detained, and searched by Officer Gavin Holt. That incident, documented from multiple angles and witnessed by hundreds of people, was not an isolated case of one officer making a mistake. It was the result of systemic failures enabled by the command structure, specifically by Deputy Chief Walter Graves." The room erupted in questions, but Darius raised a hand for silence. "I'm going to present facts. You can ask questions afterward." He nodded to Harlan, who distributed folders to the media containing Rivera's documentation, excerpts from Holt's Internal Affairs statement, with other officers' identities redacted, and a timeline of complaints against Holt that had been ignored or suppressed. Officer Rivera, Darius continued, took detailed notes of briefings and conversations in which Deputy Chief Graves encouraged aggressive profiling of certain demographic groups. Officer Holt, in his statement to Internal Affairs, confirmed that Graves specifically reassigned him to airport duty after complaints about racial profiling in his previous assignment, without requiring retraining or discipline. Additionally, Graves has systematically undermined community policing initiatives and promoted officers with histories of excessive force complaints, while sidelining officers who tried to build relationships with the community. Rivera stepped forward, visibly nervous but determined. "I have recordings, sir. I didn't mention them last night because I wanted to review them first, but I recorded 3 briefings where Graves made comments that clearly encouraged racial profiling." The room exploded. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Sarah Jennings from the Detroit News stood immediately. "You recorded Deputy Chief Graves?" Rivera nodded. "I was concerned about retaliation, and reporting his comments without evidence. So I started recording the briefings on my phone. I have recordings from March, April, and June of this year. "Can we hear them?" someone shouted. Darius nodded to Rivera, who pulled out his phone and connected it to the room's audio system. The first recording was from a morning briefing. Graves's voice was unmistakable, addressing a group of officers about airport security priorities. "We've had traveler complaints about aggressive screening," the recorded voice of Graves said. "Complaints are part of police work. You can't worry about hurting feelings when you're keeping people safe. I want you maintaining high visibility and high interaction with the usual suspects. You know who I'm talking about. Young men, urban appearance, expensive items that don't match their demographics. Trust your instincts." The second recording was even more explicit. Graves responding to an officer asking about the legality of stop and frisk procedures without probable cause. "The courts give us a lot of leeway with reasonable suspicion," Graves's voice said. "If someone looks out of place, acts nervous, or fits patterns we've seen before, that's reasonable suspicion. Don't overthink it. Make the stop. We'll sort out the legal details later. And if someone complains, we handle it internally." The third recording was damning. Graves in a one-on-one conversation with Rivera, discussing a community policing proposal Rivera had submitted. "These community partnership things don't work," Graves said with disdain. "I've been doing this for decades. You know what works? Hard enforcement of the law. Letting people know there are consequences. These neighborhoods respect force, not friendship. You want to advance in this department? Focus on arrests and citations, not barbecues and basketball games." The room fell into stunned silence when the recordings ended. The language of usual suspects, the deliberate encouragement of profiling, the contempt for community policing, the suggestion to stop first and worry about legality later, all of it documented in Graves's own voice. Darius let the silence stretch, then spoke quietly. "That's why I suspended Deputy Chief Graves, not as retaliation for questioning me, not as a political maneuver, but because he created and sustained a culture of racial bias that violated the constitutional rights of Detroit citizens. Officer Holt profiled me because he was trained and encouraged to do exactly that. Deputy Chief Graves is the system that needs to be reformed." A Washington Post reporter raised her hand. "Chief Hale, what about Graves's claim last night that you have an anti-police agenda?" Darius had anticipated it. "I don't have an anti-police agenda. I've been a police officer for decades. I've put my life on the line countless times to protect this city. What I have is an anti-corruption agenda, an anti-racism agenda, and an accountability agenda. If some people interpret demanding that officers meet constitutional standards as anti-police, that says everything about how far the culture has deteriorated." Another reporter shouted, "Have you filed criminal charges against Graves?" "Not yet," Darius said. "The FBI and Wayne County Prosecutor's Office are reviewing all evidence to determine whether criminal charges are appropriate. Regardless, Graves will face departmental discipline up to and including termination." "What about the union's vote of no confidence?" Darius smiled thinly. "The union is free to vote however they want, but I'll note that rank-and-file officers I've spoken with, including Officers Park and Rivera, support reform. The union leadership doesn't speak for all officers, only those who benefit from the current system." The press conference continued for another 45 minutes. Darius detailed his reform proposals, announced the creation of the Internal Accountability Unit, revealed that the Department of Justice had contacted him about a pattern and practice investigation that could lead to a federal consent decree, and made clear this was only the beginning of comprehensive change. When he finally stepped away from the podium, Darius felt exhausted, but satisfied. Graves's attempt to control the narrative had failed spectacularly. Instead of making Darius appear politically motivated, Graves had handed him the perfect platform to expose systemic corruption. As Darius walked away from the podium, his phone vibrated with a call from Mayor Thompson. "Darius, that was perfect. Exactly what the city needed to see. I'm getting calls from council members who are planning to oppose your reforms, and they're all backing down. The evidence is overwhelming." "I'm glad," Darius said. "But Mayor, you should prepare for this to get worse before it gets better. Graves has allies. The union is going to fight, and whoever made those threats isn't going to give up." "I know," she responded soberly. "But Darius, you've already changed the conversation. Before yesterday, police reform was a wish list from activists. Now, it's a necessity even conservative council members can't oppose. You've built the political will for change in a day. That's legacy." That afternoon, Darius met with Park and Rivera in his new office at headquarters, a space that still had Graves's belongings in boxes waiting to be removed. The two officers sat across from his desk, and Darius could see they were still processing the magnitude of what they had done. "You both took considerable risks," Darius said. "Rivera, those recordings could have cost you your job, or worse if Graves had discovered them. Park, speaking up yesterday showed courage. I want both of you to know you're now protected, and that you're going to be essential to rebuilding trust in this department." Rivera spoke carefully. "Sir, there are other officers who are coming forward now. People who witnessed things, who experienced retaliation, who saw problems but were afraid to report them. The press conference gave them hope that things might actually change." "Good," Darius said. "The Internal Accountability Unit's first priority will be creating safe channels for officers to report misconduct without fear. We need whistleblower protection with teeth, not just paper policies," Park added. "We also need to know not everyone is happy. Some senior officers are furious. They see this as a betrayal, like we broke the thin blue line code." Darius leaned forward. "Let me be clear about something. The thin blue line is supposed to represent solidarity, to protect us from external threats while we serve the community. It's not supposed to be a code of silence that protects criminals with badges. Any officer who thinks reporting misconduct is a betrayal doesn't belong in this department." His phone rang. It was Special Agent Brox from the FBI. "Chief Hale, we've traced the threatening calls. Both came from burner phones purchased with cash, activated briefly, then destroyed. But we did something interesting with voice analysis. We stripped the electronic distortion and ran the underlying voice through recognition software. We got a match." Darius felt his pulse quicken. "Who?" "Walter Graves." Darius sat very still, processing it. Graves hadn't just enabled racial profiling and retaliated against reform-minded officers. He had criminally threatened a police chief. The case against him had just expanded from administrative violations to federal crimes. Special Agent Brox continued. "We have enough for an arrest warrant. Given his law enforcement background and knowledge of procedures, we believe he's a flight risk. We'd like to move immediately." "Do it," Darius said. "And Agent Brox, make sure everything is documented. I want transparency at every step." Hours later, FBI agents arrested Walter Graves at his home in Grosse Pointe. Footage of a deputy chief in handcuffs being led to a federal vehicle played on every news channel. The symbolism was devastating. The highest-ranking officer who had enabled racism now faced justice at the same time the lower-ranking officer he had protected faced discipline. But Darius knew this was only the beginning. Graves had allies throughout the department, in city government, in the police union. Taking him down would trigger a backlash that could destabilize everything. That night, as Darius finally headed home under FBI escort, his phone rang one more time. The caller ID showed City Hall. "Chief Hale, this is Mayor Thompson. I wanted you to hear this from me first. The city council just voted unanimously to endorse your reform package. Every proposal will be funded. Darius felt a weight lift slightly. That's good news, Mayor. She laughed softly. It's great news, Darius. Do you understand what you've accomplished? In a day and a half, you've exposed systemic corruption, built a coalition for reform, and completely changed the conversation about policing in Detroit. The Department of Justice is fast-tracking a consent decree that will force citywide changes. You've started a movement, but movements have backlash, Darius said quietly. I know. That's why I'm assigning additional security for you and your family. And Darius, there's something else. The president called today. He saw the videos. He wants you to join a national task force on police reform. This isn't just Detroit anymore. The whole country is watching. Darius drove home that night with FBI agents following, news vans on his street, his phone exploding with messages, and felt the weight of what he had unleashed. Change was coming, but change had enemies, and those enemies were circling. In the time since that day at the airport, Darius Hale stood at the window of his office overlooking Detroit, watching as sunset painted the city in shades of orange and gold. His briefcase, the same worn leather case that had started everything, rested on his desk. Inside were updated reform documents, progress reports, and plans for the next phase of transformation. The numbers told part of the story. Complaints about racial profiling had dropped significantly. Community trust ratings had improved markedly. Use of force had decreased. Officer-involved shootings had dropped for the first time in years. The department had successfully processed multiple officers for misconduct, retrained others, and promoted officers with a community focus to leadership positions. The external story was even more striking. Graves had been convicted on federal charges of witness intimidation, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. He received a prison sentence and permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification. Holt had been terminated, completed a plea agreement that avoided jail, and was now working with a civil rights organization, teaching about the consequences of bias. The police union had elected new leadership after the former president was implicated in covering up misconduct. The Internal Accountability Unit run by Park and Rivera had become a national model, featured in Department of Justice presentations on best practices in police reform. But the real change was harder to quantify. It lived in the way officers now approached community interactions, knowing accountability existed. It existed in the trust Black parents felt when their children left the house, a little less worried about routine police encounters. It manifested in the growing number of young people from marginalized communities applying to the force, believing they could be part of the solution. Darius thought of the airport terminal, of the moment he had decided to endure the humiliation rather than end it quickly. That decision had cost him. The threats had continued for months. His son had transferred universities because of harassment from police union sympathizers. His wife had faced attempts at intimidation from anonymous sources. Darius himself had survived 2 internal attempts to undermine his authority and a serious death threat that forced temporary relocation of his family. But that decision had also created the political will for change that decades of reports and studies had not achieved. The video documentation of systemic racism had forced even skeptics to acknowledge the problem. Graves's recordings had proven the corruption was not hypothetical, but institutional. And Darius's response, firm but not vengeful, focused on systems rather than individuals, had demonstrated that reform could be both just and practical. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Harlan entered, now promoted to deputy chief, carrying a folder. "You wanted to see the latest academy graduation statistics?" she said, handing him the report. Darius reviewed the numbers and smiled. The incoming class was significantly diverse, highly educated, and had passed enhanced bias screening exams. These recruits had been trained under new protocols, emphasizing de-escalation, community collaboration, and constitutional policing. They represented the future. "Is there anything else?" Harlan said, shifting tone. "A letter arrived at headquarters today. It's addressed to you personally from Gavin Holt." Darius took the envelope, surprised. He hadn't heard from Holt since the airport confrontation. He opened it and began reading. The letter was 3 handwritten pages, detailed and raw. Holt apologized again, but this time with a specificity and depth that suggested genuine self-examination. He described the therapy he had been attending, the bias training he had completed, the volunteer work he was doing with the civil rights organization. He acknowledged the harm he had caused, not just to Darius, but to every black person he had profiled during his career, to every community he had helped alienate from law enforcement, to every citizen whose constitutional rights he had violated. But the most striking part was Holt's request. He asked permission to speak at the next police academy graduation and tell the new recruits about his mistakes and the consequences of unchecked bias. He wasn't asking for anything in return, no recommendation, no forgiveness, just the opportunity to prevent others from destroying their careers and harming their communities the way he had. Darius read the letter twice, then looked at Harlan. "What do you think?" She considered it carefully. "A year ago, I would have said no, let him disappear into obscurity. But I've seen the community's response to your reforms. People don't just want punishment, they want prevention. If Holt can genuinely help shape the next generation to avoid his mistakes, that's powerful." Darius nodded slowly. "Contact him. Tell him I'll allow a trial. He'll speak at the next graduation, but under strict conditions. He tells the whole truth. He doesn't minimize his actions. He doesn't make himself the victim. And if the response is positive, we'll consider making him a regular part of academy training." Harlan smiled. "The fact that you're willing to give him that chance says everything about why these reforms are working. You're focused on outcomes, not revenge." After Harlan left, Darius sat at his desk and pulled out his phone. His son Jamal had texted earlier about a successful week. No police stops, no harassment. His daughter Aisha had sent a photo from overseas, proud in her military uniform, with a note saying she was considering applying to the Detroit Police Department when her service ended, because now she believed she could make a difference. Elena had left a message reminding him they had dinner that night with community leaders, people who had spent years fighting for reform and were now becoming partners in implementing it. His phone vibrated with a new message from an unknown number. Darius tensed instinctively, but the message was simple. "Thank you for not giving up on us. Signed, a Detroit officer who wants to be better." Darius set the phone down and looked back at the briefcase. A day at the airport, that briefcase had been used as evidence of his supposed criminality. Today, it represented the transformation of an entire department. Tomorrow, it would carry plans to expand reform to other Michigan cities that had requested Detroit's help. The work continued, and it probably always would. Systems built over decades wouldn't be completely changed in a single day. There were still officers resistant to reform. There were still community members skeptical that change was real. There were still politicians who saw law and order as code for suppression rather than service. But the direction was clear, the momentum undeniable, and Darius had something Graves and his allies had never counted on. He had the truth on his side, documented from every angle, and a community demanding accountability. The office door opened again, and Elena entered, dressed for dinner, expression warm. "Ready to go?" Darius stood, taking his briefcase by habit, though he wouldn't need it for dinner. "Almost. I was just thinking about where we've been. and where we're going." She came closer and kissed him softly. "I'm proud of you. What you've built here is going to outlast your tenure. You've created a model other cities can follow. That's legacy." They walked out together, passing officers who nodded with respect, community members visiting headquarters who smiled to see them, recruits studying in the academy library who represented the future of policing. Darius thought of his grandfather, beaten by Detroit police decades ago. Of his father, stopped and searched during the 1980s. Of his son, stopped multiple times the previous year. 3 generations of Hale men harassed by the same police department he now commanded. But his son's message that day had said something that meant everything. No stops this week. The cycle was breaking. Not completely, not perfectly, but measurably. Change was happening. As they drove to dinner, Elena told him about a case she was working. A civil rights lawsuit against a suburban department that was watching Detroit's reforms and beginning to make changes preemptively. The ripple effect was spreading beyond city limits, proving transformation was possible when leaders had courage and communities demanded accountability. At the restaurant, Darius shook hands with Pastor Williams, who had led protests after police shootings, with Attorney Jackson, who had filed dozens of brutality lawsuits, with Councilwoman Davis, who had fought for years for oversight. Former adversaries who were now allies, working together to rebuild trust between police and community. During dinner, they talked about the challenges ahead, sustaining reforms amid budget constraints, preventing backsliding when media attention faded, expanding programs that addressed root causes of crime rather than focusing only on enforcement. They also talked about the wins, neighborhoods reporting greater safety and better relationships with officers, officers reporting less stress and greater job satisfaction under community policing models, young people participating in youth programs that built bridges instead of walls. When dessert arrived, Pastor Williams raised his glass to Chief Hale, who could have kept his appointment quiet and avoided the pain of public humiliation, but chose to endure it so the entire system would be exposed. That's what leaders do. They sacrifice personal comfort for collective progress. Everyone toasted, and Darius felt the warmth of genuine collaboration. This was what policing could be: community members and officers working together, not in opposition, but in cooperation, sharing the goal of safe neighborhoods and justice for all. Driving home that night, Darius's phone rang one final time. The caller ID showed his son. "Dad," Jamal said, voice full of excitement, "I just got accepted to University of Michigan Law School. I'm going to be a civil rights attorney like Mom. I'm going to focus on police accountability law." Darius felt his throat tighten with emotion. "That's incredible, son. I'm so proud of you. I know we talked about maybe me joining the force after you reformed it," Jamal continued. "But I realized I can have more impact from the legal side, holding departments accountable, advocating for people whose rights are violated, pushing policy changes. You changed Detroit from the inside. I'm going to keep changing systems from the outside." "That's perfect," Darius said quietly. "We need both." Later, standing in his bedroom looking out at the quiet street, FBI protection no longer necessary, news vans gone, threats ended, Darius thought of the airport terminal and the choice he had made. One moment, one decision to document injustice rather than escape it. That moment had cost him comfort and safety, but it had created change that would protect thousands of people who would never know his name. Reform wasn't just about rules and policies. It was about the willingness to stay in the fire long enough for others to see the flames. It was about sacrificing personal peace for collective justice. It was about understanding that the briefcase some tried to use as evidence of criminality could become a symbol of transformation. Darius opened the briefcase one more time. Inside were plans for the next phase: expanding bias training, implementing restorative justice programs, creating youth councils to advise the department on community relations, establishing mental health response teams, developing early intervention systems to identify problem officers before they caused harm. The work continued. The struggle continued. But so did the progress. What do you think of this story? Have you or someone you know experienced racial profiling or witnessed an injustice that needed to be addressed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Stories like Darius Hale's remind us that change is possible when people have the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult and dangerous. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives about justice, courage, and transformation. Share this story with others who need to.
Mãi đi theo những chặng đường con qua, anh chẳng ngả nhuộm tình câu hát. Hỡi người đừng vội sang ngang, bên sông còn đò.
Remember, change doesn't happen because of one moment or one person. It happens because people choose again and again to stand up, speak out, and transform systems from within. May we all find the courage to make that choice when our moment comes. Until next time, stay strong, stay hopeful, and keep fighting for justice.